Barron Trump goes head-to-head with a philosophy professor known for tearing down faith with pure logic. What starts out as a typical debate about faith and reason quickly turns into something no one expected. By the end, the entire class and even the professor is left speechless. The air in the prestigious private high school in New York City buzzed with a quiet intensity as students shuffled into Mr. Richard Nolan's philosophy class. It was the kind of class that students both dreaded and anticipated, a mental battlefield where debates weren't just encouraged but expected. Mr. Nolan, a sharp-witted, no-nonsense teacher, had built a reputation for challenging conventional beliefs, particularly when it came to faith, morality, and the existence of God. He didn't just lecture, he performed, engaging students in debates that often left them scrambling for answers, as he methodically dismantled their arguments with precision. Today's topic had been written in bold letters on the board: Faith vs. Reason. Is religion still relevant? The title alone sent a ripple of excitement through the room. Everyone knew what was coming. Mr. Nolan's debates about religion were legendary. Some students had even come prepared, having watched past discussions where believers had tried and failed to hold their ground against his relentless questioning. Others, particularly those less interested in philosophy, simply sat back, ready to be entertained. The bell rang, and Mr. Nolan strode confidently to the front of the class, his usual smirk in place. He scanned the room, eyes glinting with anticipation. "All right, let's get straight to it," he said, folding his arms. "Who here still believes in God?" His voice carried both curiosity and amusement, as if daring someone to speak up. A few students shifted uncomfortably, while others smirked, waiting to see who would take the bait. Then, after a brief silence, a single hand went up: Barron Trump. A few heads turned. Mr. Nolan's smirk widened. He had just found his next opponent. Mr. Nolan's eyes gleamed with interest as he locked onto Barron Trump, the lone student willing to take the challenge. The classroom, once filled with the shuffling of papers and quiet murmurs, stilled in anticipation. Nolan, a master at philosophical debates, thrived in these moments. When a student stepped forward, unaware of the intellectual storm that awaited them, he took a slow step toward Barron, arms still folded, his smirk never wavering. "Ah, Barron, you believe in God?" His tone was both amused and incredulous, as if the very notion was outdated. Barron, calm and composed, simply nodded. "Interesting," Nolan turned slightly, addressing the entire class. "Now, let's think critically for a moment. If God is real, if he is this all-powerful, all-loving being, why does he allow suffering? Why do innocent children die? Why do natural disasters wipe out entire communities?" He paced the front of the classroom, his voice measured, confident. A few students nodded along, some whispering to each other, already expecting Barron to falter. Nolan turned back to him, his gaze piercing. "So tell me, Barron, if this God of yours exists, why hasn't he stepped in? Why hasn't he prevented wars, diseases, or the tragedies we see on the news every day?" It was his signature move, a question that had dismantled past students in seconds. Most would fumble, stammer, grasp at vague reasoning about God's plan, and ultimately fall into his rhetorical trap. Barron, however, didn't blink. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he simply studied Mr. Nolan, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched longer than expected, creating a slight shift in the room's energy. Mr. Nolan, expecting a quick stumble, instead found himself waiting. The students who had been grinning moments before leaned in slightly. Then, finally, Barron spoke, calmly, evenly, and with quiet confidence. "You're asking the wrong question." The room tensed. Mr. Nolan raised an eyebrow. This was not the response he had expected. A murmur rippled through the room as Barron Trump's unexpected response hung in the air. Mr. Nolan, who had anticipated the usual flustered attempt at theological justification, tilted his head slightly, intrigued but not yet impressed. "The wrong question," he repeated, his smirk flickering with amusement. "All right, Barron, enlighten us. What's the right question?" Barron leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. His voice was measured, steady, completely unfazed by the eyes locked onto him. "You keep asking why God allows bad things to happen," he said. "But let's flip that for a second. Why does anything good happen at all?" The classroom stilled. A few students exchanged quick glances, some eyebrows raising in curiosity. Mr. Nolan, always quick on his feet, let out a short chuckle. "That's easy," he said, pacing the front of the room. "Human cooperation, societal progress, evolutionary advantage. We help each other because it benefits our survival." He gestured broadly. "Altruism isn't divine, Barron. It's biological." Barron nodded, as if he had expected this answer. "So, if that's true," he countered, "then why do people sacrifice for strangers, even when it offers them no survival advantage? Why do parents rush into burning buildings for their children? Why do people risk their lives for justice, even when they gain nothing in return?" The room fell silent again. A few students, who had previously seemed dismissive, now leaned in slightly, curious. Mr. Nolan narrowed his eyes slightly but kept his composure. "Emotion, instinct, social conditioning," he said smoothly. "We're wired to protect our species." Barron didn't flinch. "And where did that wiring come from?" For a split second, Mr. Nolan hesitated, just long enough for some students to notice. Barron continued, "You're saying morality is just an evolutionary byproduct, but if that's true, then why do we instinctively know that some things are wrong even when society once accepted them? Why do we admire those who stand against injustice even when they stand alone?" The energy in the room had changed. What had started as Nolan's usual dismantling of faith was no longer following the script. For the first time, the debate was not one-sided, and everyone could feel it. Mr. Nolan's confident smirk flickered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. He was used to steering debates, leading students into intellectual traps where their arguments collapsed under his precise logic. But this time, Barron had shifted the conversation entirely, not focusing on suffering, but on goodness itself. The energy in the room had changed. The usual script wasn't playing out. "All right," Nolan said, folding his arms. "Let's follow your logic. You're saying goodness is proof of something greater? That because people do kind things, it somehow points to a divine creator?" His tone was light, but there was an edge to it, a hint of frustration at having to play defense. Barron remained unfazed. "I'm saying that if the universe is purely random, if everything we do is just biological survival, then good and evil don't really exist. They're just human concepts." A few students nodded while others frowned, considering the weight of his words. "And that's exactly my point," Nolan shot back. "Morality is human-made. Societies create rules to survive, and what we call good is just what benefits the most people." Barron tilted his head slightly. "So, by that reasoning, slavery was moral when most people accepted it?" A wave of discomfort passed through the room. Even students who had been grinning at Nolan's earlier points now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Nolan's jaw tightened, but he forced another chuckle. "That's an oversimplification," he said. "Society progresses. We learn from our mistakes and evolve morally." Barron didn't let up. "But if morality is just a product of society, what makes progress possible? If there's no higher standard for right and wrong, what drives people to stand up for justice, even when society tells them they're wrong?" Silence. Barron continued, his voice steady but firm. "People like Martin Luther King Jr., like Harriet Tubman, like those who hid Jewish families during the Holocaust. They weren't following the morality of the majority. They stood against it. And if morality is just an evolving human invention, why do we instinctively recognize their courage as right, even when, at the time, they were condemned?" Mr. Nolan opened his mouth, but for the first time, no immediate rebuttal came. The students sat in stunned silence, watching a debate unfold that none of them had expected. For the first time, Mr. Nolan wasn't in control of the conversation. Barron was. A noticeable tension filled the room as Barron Trump's words lingered in the air. The usual rhythm of Mr. Nolan's debates, posing a tough question, watching students crumble, delivering the final intellectual blow, had been interrupted. Barron had flipped the script, and now Nolan had to wrestle with a response he hadn't prepared for. "All right," Nolan said, pacing slightly, his fingers drumming against the desk. "Let's say I grant you that morality isn't just something we invent. That still doesn't mean it comes from God. Maybe it's just a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, one that benefits civilization as a whole." Barron nodded slightly, as if considering the thought, but then he pressed forward. If morality is just about what benefits civilization, then what happens when society decides that something destructive is beneficial? What stops them? Mr. Nolan exhaled sharply, regaining some of his composure. "We do. We stop ourselves. Society self-corrects. We learn from history and improve." Barron didn't let up. "Then why does every generation look back at the past and feel disgusted by things that were once considered normal?" He leaned forward slightly. "Why do we instinctively recognize certain things as evil, even when they were widely accepted before?" A few students, who had once been chuckling at Nolan's earlier confidence, now exchanged quiet glances. They had seen Nolan dismantle arguments before, but this felt different. "Because we evolve," Nolan countered, his voice firm but slightly more forced. "Societies grow more enlightened over time. What we see as evil now may have been acceptable in the past, but that doesn't mean morality is absolute. It just means we've gotten better at defining it." Barron tilted his head. "But doesn't that imply that there's a higher standard we're moving toward? If morality was purely human-made, why would we feel instinctively repulsed by things that were once accepted?" The question hung heavy in the room. Mr. Nolan's jaw tightened, but this time he didn't immediately answer. A student in the front row, Samantha Carter, who had previously been nodding along with Nolan's arguments, now looked deep in thought. For the first time, the class wasn't just watching a debate, they were questioning what they believed. The room, once filled with quiet chuckles and knowing glances, had shifted into a contemplative silence. Mr. Nolan, usually so quick to steer the conversation, now seemed to be choosing his words more carefully. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Samantha Carter. "But what about suffering?" she asked, her voice softer but resolute. "Even if morality points to something deeper, why does suffering exist? Why would a good God allow people, especially innocent people, to experience so much pain?" It was the question everyone had been waiting for, the one Nolan had originally used to open the debate. A few students nodded in agreement, as if relieved someone had finally put it back on the table. Barron turned to Samantha, his expression sincere, not dismissive or defensive. "That's a fair question," he said. "One I think everyone wrestles with at some point." He paused, as if carefully considering how to answer. "But let me ask you something. Have you ever lost someone?" Samantha blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah," she admitted after a pause. "My grandfather last year." Barron nodded gently. "And did it change you?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I guess, yeah." Barron leaned forward slightly. "Pain is awful, no one wants to suffer, but if we never experienced hardship, we wouldn't grow, we wouldn't change. Loss reminds us to appreciate time. Struggles teach us resilience. And if we believe suffering has no purpose, then what do we make of people who go through the worst and come out stronger?" The room was so still that even the hum of the overhead light seemed loud. Mr. Nolan wasn't smirking anymore. Barron finished his thought. "If we only judge God by whether he prevents suffering, we miss the bigger picture. The people who changed the world the most weren't those who had easy lives. They were the ones who suffered and still chose to fight for something greater." A student in the back shifted uncomfortably. Others sat in thoughtful silence. For the first time, it wasn't just Mr. Nolan facing Barron. The entire class was. Mr. Nolan exhaled slowly, the usual sharpness in his gaze now replaced with something else, something closer to reluctant contemplation. He had spent years refining his arguments, dismantling belief with ruthless efficiency, yet here he was, unable to immediately dismiss Barron's reasoning. Then Barron did something no one expected. Instead of pressing further, instead of driving the debate into another logical corner, he changed direction completely. "Mr. Nolan," Barron asked, his voice even, "do you love anyone?" The question cut through the tension like a blade. Some students raised their eyebrows, others looked between Barron and Nolan, curious where this was going. Mr. Nolan blinked. "What? Do you love anyone?" Barron repeated, tilting his head slightly. "A family member, a friend, anyone?" A beat of silence. Then reluctantly, Mr. Nolan nodded. "Of course." Barron leaned back. "Prove it." A few students let out small gasps, while others murmured in confusion. Mr. Nolan furrowed his brows. "What do you mean, prove it?" Barron shrugged. "Show me love in a test tube. Measure it. Weigh it. Give me scientific proof that it exists." Mr. Nolan opened his mouth, then shut it again. Barron's voice was calm but firm. "Some things are real, even if you can't see or measure them. That's why I believe in God." For the first time all class, Mr. Nolan had nothing to say. The final bell rang, signaling the end of class, yet no one moved. The usual rush to pack up, the scraping of chairs, the eager chatter about weekend plans, all of it was absent. Instead, the students sat in a stunned silence, as if reluctant to break whatever had just happened. Mr. Nolan, who had dominated so many debates, stood motionless at his desk. His usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a thoughtful, unreadable expression. For the first time, he hadn't won the debate, not in the way he was used to. Barron didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't act victorious. He simply gathered his notebook, slung his bag over his shoulder, and made his way toward the door. A few students watched him go, some with expressions of curiosity, others with something closer to respect. Samantha Carter, who had questioned him earlier, lingered for a moment before finally closing her notebook, her eyes thoughtful. Other students exchanged glances, the weight of the discussion still hanging over them. Mr. Nolan cleared his throat, but for once he had no final remark, no witty last word to reassert his authority. Instead, he just nodded. "See you all next class," he said simply. And with that, the students finally stood, filing out, not laughing, not dismissing what had happened, but deep in thought. Because for the first time, the debate hadn't just been about winning, it had been about making people think. And Barron Trump had done just that. The lesson from this debate wasn't about winning or losing, it was about challenging perspectives and encouraging deeper thought. Mr. Nolan, a seasoned skeptic, had built a reputation for dismantling faith with logic, but for the first time, he encountered a student who didn't just defend his beliefs, but flipped the conversation entirely. Barron Trump didn't rely on blind faith or emotional appeals. He used reason, morality, and even science to challenge the assumption that God's existence should be measured by suffering alone. By shifting the discussion to the existence of goodness, morality, and love, he forced everyone, not just Mr. Nolan, to rethink their own assumptions. The story teaches us that true wisdom isn't about shutting down opposing views. It's about engaging with them, questioning them, and being open to ideas beyond our own biases. Faith and reason are often seen as opposing forces, but as Barron demonstrated, they can coexist in a way that strengthens both. Perhaps the most powerful takeaway isn't just that Barron held his own, but that by the end of the discussion, even the most skeptical minds were thinking in ways they hadn't before. And sometimes, that's the real victory.